The country's varying stages of hard lockdowns dealt blows to many people. During this time, many people worked remotely, and there's a lot of pressure to be back in the office at some companies. The cost of living is rising, leaving people stressed out, especially if your company is downscaling, retrenching, or even streamlining work processes. Today I'm joined by Sikander Kalla, who is a clinical psychologist and founder of Cohesive Collaboration, a mental wellness business. Thank you for joining me, Sikander. I appreciate your time. I hope I didn't butcher your surname
no, not at all,
too much there.
No.
Just this whole process of, for 2 years, people could work remotely. And my sense was that the testimonials were that the workload didn't decrease. Instead, actually, it may have increased. But people were in their home spaces. Social interactions were broken off to a certain degree, at least the work ones. Yeah. Now, it seems the pressure is go back, go back, go back. Yeah. What does that do to us psychologically, and how do we cope with it?
Yeah, I think it's a very pertinent question, given the fact that we've been going through massive adjustment. With the pandemic, with every subsequent lockdown that has come, there's been massive adjustment. And I think that's the question here, essentially, is how are we coping with all of this adjustment and what impact does it have on us? And I think going back into the period of the lockdown period, you see that a lot of people struggled with blurred workplace boundaries. People working into late in the evening, there was no sort of clear delineation of what was expected, and that placed quite a lot of burden on individuals. And then we went into the subsequent easing of lockdown periods, where we had this hybrid model, which was an adjustment in itself, because in one space you're betwixt and between. You're in this liminal phase where you're sometimes working from home, sometimes going into the office, so you're struggling to find your structure, your rhythm, and your routine. And now, us going more and more back into the workplace, there's a lot of other things we need to be on the lookout for. I hypothesized that a lot of individuals also experiencing some level of social anxiety with all the stimulation and sensory overload that they may be experiencing in the workplace.
Your workplace previously was just a workplace of a space of one person and a computer interacting with countless other people virtually, and come Monday you're back in an office where there's 100 people. They're talking, it's loud. They'll come and interrupt your thought flow and workflow as well. Is that what you're talking about?
Exactly. That is the main dilemma at the moment, that the adjustment to the sensory overload, but also at the same time expectations shift when you're in different contexts. Out of sight, out of mind sometimes, or out of sight, sometimes the employer feels a bit more anxious to demand a bit more from you. So you're struggling also with the demands changing at each step of the process. And I think, interestingly enough, we find ourselves in a corporate setting or workplace setting where it feels like the main incentive, the monetary incentive, is to maximize output from individuals. But what we often fail to realize is when people are in the most optimal state from a well-being perspective, that's when also they start giving the sort of output that you'd appreciate. So it doesn't need to be a damned if you do, damned if you don't, and that sort of approach. I think it needs to be a collaborative endeavor where employers understand that by enhancing the well-being of employees, they can get better outcomes as well from that.
But is that happening?
Easier said than done, unfortunately. Easier said than done.
The situation is not helped, is it, Sikander, by the fact that as we make this transition and adjustment, the country, the continent, the globe is going through so many of these challenges, particularly in as far as the cost of living is concerned. You are having, I imagine, a lot of people are having to adjust that I didn't have the cost of driving to the office just 2-3 months ago. Now suddenly I'm back with that, and not only do I have it, it's actually much higher than I remember it being.
Yes, that also very, very insightful, because from the perspective of thinking about the workplace, we often classify them and categorize them as workplace, personal life, but workplace does not occur in a vacuum. You're still subject to the elements, and the elements in this case, like you're rightfully pointing out, high cost of living, high fuel price increase, all of these particular things combined with just a general state of unease in the world at the moment and uncertainty. I think we find ourselves in a space where the anxiety levels are at an all-time high, but also at the same time we suffer in silence because it's difficult to bring that to the employer. The employer says, come to work at this particular time. Well, your transport cost is none of my concern. And that's a very difficult thing, because even if it's none of the employer's concern, it is your concern. And you cater to that employer. And your well-being is informed by all the other stressors that you're experiencing on a daily basis.
Was there a sense in which, Sikander, we were sort of shielded from what people call workplace toxicity by working remotely? Now, suddenly, that boss that will say to you, your fuel costs are none of my concern, is suddenly a few meters away from you.
Yeah.
You knew they existed, you knew they were there throughout this period of time, but now you are in the same physical space.
Yeah, I think it's a tough one, because I think the stressors were always there, they just manifest differently. Because I think workplace politics is something that's somewhat inevitable in any workplace setting. And how you navigate through them will differ relative to when you're working from home versus when you're working at the office. So that boss that maybe is not on your throat in physical form might have been there through calls, through emails at odd hours of the day, whereas now the additional burden is the sensory overload in the workplace, it's the different colleagues that you may be working with. Those add a different element to it. And I think that's what we need to be mindful of.
But it's not all doom and gloom, is it? I mean, the social element, I remember having these conversations a few months ago, that it's part of what people missed, human beings being social beings.
Yeah.
So there's at least that cushion, or is it?
That's true. I think we could refer to that as a protective factor. I think as human beings, from an evolutionary perspective, we're hardwired to be social beings. And we saw this with the social isolation and the social withdrawal during strict lockdown periods. So I completely agree with you that I think the silver lining is you get some nourishment in one domain, which could be the increased interpersonal communication and the resonance, and also the shared experiences. Because when we work in the same workplace, we get that sense of, hey, the struggles I'm experiencing are the struggles someone else is experiencing.
Yeah.
And when we're at home and we're behind computer screens, we don't get the time to connect in those ways, to say, hey, I'm having a similar experience to you. And sharing a similar experience normalizes the process. And normalizing it drops our anxiety levels.
So help us cope then, Sikander. That's the benefit of having you here.
Yeah.
We can consult without paying you. How does mindfulness come into all of this?
Yeah.
Just explain it to me like someone who has no clue. That's your specialty.
Yeah.
What is mindfulness, and how does it feature then in dealing with these conversations we've been having the last few minutes?
So one of the ways I'd describe mindfulness is the attunement to self-awareness in a given space. And what I mean by that is to be able to track where you're at, how you're doing. It's almost somewhat of an introspective process, but it also encompasses other external variables. And what do I mean by that? Let's say, for example, your well-being is informed by a myriad of things, possibly your sleep, how well you're sleeping, your appetite, your energy levels, your activity levels. If you are mindful of how well you're sleeping and you're mindful of your appetite and your energy levels, slowly but surely you can adjust the routine there so that you find what's most optimized for you. But you can't do that if you're not mindful. You can't do that if you're not tracking how you're doing on a daily basis. You can't do that if you're not checking in with yourself and saying, am I a bit stretched at work? What's happening at the moment? Is it a busy period of the year, or has it been a cumulative sustained period? What are my burnout levels at? Do I need to take some time off? Do I need to find other ways, some compensatory mechanisms, healthy exercise or something like that, that can compensate for some of the stress that we may be experiencing? The first step is being aware that there's an issue and being aware that you need to track these things over a longitudinal period of time.
All right. Thank you for that. I think that's really helpful and insightful. And you explained it very well for someone who was just grappling with the whole concept. Thank you for coming through, Sikander Kalla.
Welcome.
Just sharing some of the insights about returning to a physical workplace. Many people, I saw an email at one institution of higher education that said, guess what, guys, lectures are back starting from the next term. And a lot of people are not as happy as you would have imagined they would be after 2 years of being at home.